I think it's going to the autonomous taxi delivery of mobility as a service. And we already have examples of this mobility as a service. It's just not automated. And we need to learn about it and how well it's doing, especially with respect to sharing rides. So we're going to hear about it now as to how Melba, you want to lead us into it.
Okay, such a pleasure to be here. This microphone has been tricking everybody all day long. Okay. This is an old-style rock star sort of microphone now. It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Melba Kerman. I'm a writer and technology analyst, and over the past few years, I've seen how much this field has grown and developed, and in particular, I've been a big fan of Elaine's work here. And many of the people speaking today are, in this world, quite famous, so it's really exciting to be here. Today, this final panel is going to be about ride-hailing. Basically, why we need it, where is it going as a business, what's going on with development and testing, and that sort of thing. So we have speaking today Bruce Schaller from Schaller Consulting, and then we will also have Feng Ming Gong, who is the head of research at DD Research Institute, and then last but not least is going to be Matthew Dawes, who is a former commissioner of New York City Taxi and Limo Commission.
All right, good afternoon. It's gotten to be a long afternoon. I'm going to try and keep you interested in the topic, though. How many people here, first I'd like to do a couple show of hands. How many people here spend most of your day focused on technology, automated vehicles, software development, all that kind of stuff? All right. Okay, most of the crowd. It's been interesting, not usually the crowd, not usually the composition of the audience I speak to, so it's great to be here. Thank you, Alan, for inviting me. How many people live in cities?
Princeton, the city?
City, parts of it.
This is country.
So the purpose of what I'm talking about is to connect the technology and the city part. Because where this technology is going to land is mainly in cities, and mainly in big cities, and that's what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about: Boston, New York, DC, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, and the like. And my starting point is really based on the belief that how autonomous vehicle technology lands in cities will determine the future of them both. And I'll explain why. How does one make this whole screen?
All the way down the bottom of the screen icon.
I'm not.
Four squares. Right
There? Great.
Yeah,
There we go.
probably best
Just use the arrows. All right. So there's two views of how all this is going to unfold. One is a utopian view, and Sam Schwartz talked about this morning, where autonomous vehicles enable there to be less traffic, less congestion, need for less parking, lower emissions, and the like. And then there's another view that, depending on the particulars of how things work out, you could end up with significantly more congestion and urban sprawl, more GHG emissions, and a lot of people are starting to conclude that it's the level of pooling of actual shared rides, strangers riding together in a vehicle, that will determine which of these futures actually come to pass in major American cities. Well, as Alan was saying in his introduction, and kind of the reason I'm here, is we don't have to speculate, we don't have to wait for some future date, some years from now, to see how all this might develop, and to learn a few lessons that we can act on starting today to help us realize the utopian vision instead of the vision of more sprawl and congestion and the like. Because when these vehicles are introduced at scale, most people expect, because they need to be intensively used given their costs, that it will make the most sense, it'll pencil out for them to be integrated with what we now call, Uber and Lyft and other companies that get into this with shared autonomous vehicles. And they'll be operated not as some separate fleet, but they'll be operated as in mixed fleets. So you'll have human-driven Ubers and Lyfts and the like. How many people know the term TNC, Transportation Network Company? That's what they call them. California decided on that. You can blame the California PUC. So you have human-driven TNCs and autonomous in mixed fleets together. So we can tell a lot about what this world might look like in the future by looking at the world of TNCs today. Well, there's a few things that we know. First of all, we know they're already big business. I estimate in 2017 there were 2.6 billion passengers in Uber and Lyft and other TNC vehicles, and that is growing, as you can see, at a rapid rate, both adding trips overall and also shifting from traditional taxi cabs. And I think by the end of the year or early next year, just to give a sense of scale, the ridership in this sector, TNCs and taxis together, will exceed that of local buses in the United States. So they're big already and growing quickly. And they're concentrated, as I think we all know, in the downtowns and central areas of major American cities, as these graphics in 4 big American cities shows. And we know, and there's some new survey data that really pins this down, but it's no surprise that people who use TNCs tend to be younger, higher income, educated, and urban. People who are still predominantly reliant on taxi cabs live disproportionately in small towns, are older and disabled, and for obvious reasons may not have cell phones. So that's kind of the lay of the land. Research over the last year, starting with a study that I released early in 2017, has found that while clearly Uber and Lyft and other TNCs have really added in wonderful ways a new mobility option in cities and throughout the country for people, at the same time, they're significantly adding to traffic congestion. And I've calculated almost 1 billion additional miles of driving in the 5 boroughs of New York City since 2013, leading the Governor's Commission on this to label them as significantly contributing to recent increases in Manhattan congestion. Same type of finding in San Francisco, Boston. Alejandro is here today in the Denver area, and in 7 major cities in the UC Davis work that was also referred to earlier. So the issue here is how we realize both the benefits to mobility, to getting around town, wherever you might be, where you live, when you travel. Those benefits seem to be at tension, in these big cities at least, with the societal good, the societal objectives and goals of reducing congestion, reducing emissions, making it easier to get around, not just by TNC, but if you happen to be in some other vehicle, in your own car, on a bus, trucks delivering other commercial vehicles. So that's the tension. How do we sort of achieve both of those at the same time? Well, it's widely, and there's been a lot of discussion here already as well, that the answer here is sharing. So strangers in a vehicle together, obviously if you have multiple traveling parties together, it requires fewer trips and less mileage. And so the question that I'll spend the balance of this time of my presentation talking about is, what can we learn from today's experience about what makes sharing work to resolve the tension between what's good for the individual in improved mobility with Uber, Lyft, and other TNCs, and the societal needs to reduce congestion, reduce driving, reduce emissions, and increase the quality of life in cities. What will work? And I would suggest to you that the answer to this question is really important not only for cities, but it's also really important for autonomous vehicle technology. Because if autonomous vehicles are introduced most visibly in big cities and are seen as greatly exacerbating existing congestion and emissions and traffic safety issues, people are going to take kind of a dim view of the technology. And so it's really important to, from both the technology hats that most of us wear and from the city hats that many of us also wear. So it turns out that you can answer this question with some simple math. I'm going to go through some really simple math, and then I'm going to put real-world numbers on it because I said earlier we can use real-world experience to inform the discussion we're having today. But 3 examples show why sharing could or might not be the answer to increased congestion from the growth of the use of TNCs and shared autonomous, perhaps electric vehicles in the future. So let's take 3 simple examples. You have a personal motor vehicle trip of 4 miles. What is that? It takes 4 vehicle miles as well as 4 passenger miles. I'm assuming a traveling party of 1 for simplicity, but the same numbers, they all come out the same if you have multiple people traveling together. With a TNC trip, this exclusive ride, 1 person, 1 passenger, you have, let's say in this example, a mile where the driver has dropped off someone, but before he gets his next trip, another mile to go pick up the passenger, the 4 miles of passenger transport. So that all adds up to 6 vehicle miles for those 4 passenger miles, or a 50% increase in vehicle mileage because of TNCs. Sharing helps because we now have 2 people traveling 4 miles each, 8 vehicle miles if they use their personal car. You work through the math and you have them share, you might get something like 6 vehicle miles to transport those 2 people, or a 25% reduction from 8 vehicle miles to 6 for the same number of passenger miles in both examples. So that's how sharing can help, but it doesn't necessarily help. Because the fact is, in big cities, maybe not everyone is leaving a car behind. Maybe they took the bus or the subway, or they walked or they biked, or maybe it's a trip they weren't going to make, except for the TNC being there. So in this example, suppose that 1 person is replacing an auto trip and someone else is replacing a bus trip. You work through the math, you have 4 vehicle miles there, but you still, in the pre-TNC scenario, but you still have 6 vehicle miles when they use the shared ride, a 50% increase in mileage. So you can see, depending on the numbers, it can come out either way. It can be good in terms of the impact on cities, or TNCs can be bad. Now, I'd like to put some real-world numbers on these. I'm working up a report that will have this in detail, and I'll just run through this quickly. But the real-world numbers, based on a number of major cities here, is that drivers are going just over 2 miles after making a drop-off before they get their next trip, driving just under a mile to the pickup location, and then about a 5-mile trip. So that's the mileage numbers. Sharing, of course, it depends on how many people share trips, right? If nobody shares trips, none of this magic works. If everyone does it, the numbers will be much more favorable. So this is what we know. Uber and Lyft are they don't give a lot of information, but this is what we know from various data sources about the level of sharing. Currently, in major American cities, this tends to be just under about 20%. In Manhattan, by the way, during the day, it's 10%. Uber in Manhattan during the day is 6% sharing. People are using Uber. No, they want no hassle, get from A to B as quickly as possible. The price is not important. So that's in terms of how many are shared rides, and then what are they using? In my example, it was half their own car, half the bus. What are the real numbers? The real numbers from several studies are running about 40% previously used a car, taxi, rental car, different categories, And the remainder previously used transit, walk, bike, or didn't make the trip. Those are those results. So if I take those numbers I just showed, use pretty much the averages, what do I get? Well, the inputs I just went through in terms of the mileage and percentage of shared trips and 40% replacing auto trips. And the result is you get a 269% increase in vehicle miles as TNCs grow and replace a combination of auto and non-auto trips. That's why you get these studies showing these big increases in vehicle miles, VMT vehicle miles traveled, the amount of driving on city streets. You can say, well, we'll get that sharing number up, right? The companies are working hard, and I've talked to the engineers doing the software work, and they are, I think they are. Suppose we get it up to 40% shared trips. Well, the mileage increase goes down, but only by a little bit. And even if I make up some numbers, so these aren't real world numbers anymore, these are my made up, like, let's be super optimistic numbers. So you have very little time between, very little mileage between trips, you have a lot of sharing. You still get almost a doubling of mileage. So this is why people are worried. This is why people are concerned about how both Uber and Lyft are affecting cities today, and how autonomous vehicles, which will lower the price, may affect cities in the future. Now, the example I've given here is not exactly what Uber and Lyft are looking to do more of. They recognize that people don't want to get in a car and have it be driven from A to B to C to D, picking up people, and then kind of the other thing on the other end. They want to minimize the in-vehicle travel time, and they really never want to be going in the wrong direction relative to their destination. And so they've introduced services like Uber Express and Lyft Shuttle, where people walk to a designated pickup point. It's not door-to-door anymore. It's actually more like a bus or jitney or dollar van. And so the question is, can this resolve the tension between individual mobility, the individual benefit from these new forms of mobility, and the societal interests? Is this going to be, or what does it take for this to be the solution? Well, the answer is actually very simple. It takes, if the trip on right replaces 2 auto trips, then you resolve that tension and you get a reduction in mileage and emissions and the like from that change in behavior. If no one's replacing a car trip or one person, then you'll still have an increase in mileage. This sounds like it might not be that hard, but if you think about it, it's not going to happen in a sedan. A sedan, you're not going to average more than maybe 2 or 3 occupancy in a sedan. And if you've got 40% of people replacing auto trips, you're not going to get that replacement of 2. It might happen in a van, like a Chariot van running in San Francisco and a few other cities, where you could have 8 or 10 people in the vehicle and a couple of them replacing auto trips. It might happen in suburban areas where most people will be coming from cars if you can get that many people in the vehicle. So when we talk about how to solve the problem, how to solve this tension between improvement to individual mobility and to societal interest, it comes down to the number 2. Replace 2 car trips and this works. Don't replace 2 car trips, and as you expand more and more of these services out there, you will get more and more congestion, and you'll get a lot of pushback on this in cities that are already quite congested. So I could kind of stop now and say that's the challenge, and sort of a Chariot service you can envision in certain situations in cities and suburban areas, and you kind of tailor that. And I think that's a good answer to all of this. But I think there's another piece here that's important that I want to spend just a minute to make a point, We need to have a conversation about this. It needs to include people on the technology side, on the TNC side, on cities, automakers. It needs to be a conversation that includes all those folks about how to make this happen. It's difficult to do it. It's not necessarily in the interest of the companies involved to do it. So I just want to make a point about how this conversation so far has tended to go. And you can tell as I go through this, it drives me a little nuts, but I'll try and be nice about it. So John Zimmer, a year and a half ago, released a big vision statement for cities and for lift in cities and for autonomy in cities. And I did a word count. And he talks about cities and cars, vehicles, autonomous vehicles, people and networks and transportation. All right? But he doesn't talk about public transportation. Even though most Lyft riders in big cities are coming from public transportation. So it's a vision of cities without public transportation, without which they wouldn't exist. So we need to be having a conversation that includes the reality of how cities work. There's a study from MIT that said 98% of yellow taxi rides in New York could be served by just a few thousand vehicles with substantial improvements. But that doesn't take into account that if you provide such a great service at such a cheap price, some of the people, there'll be people who are using the bus and subway today who will want to use that, and you'll have a lot more demand. You'll have a lot of mode shift that comes out of that. It's not just the yellow cab riders who would want to use that. Emily Castro, who wrote very perceptively about this and when she was at Lyft, said Lyft Shuttle can help bridge the gaps in transit underscored areas in Chicago, underserved areas, in responding to people who are making the point, hey, shuttle looks a lot like the bus. So that was good. 2 years later, this is a map of where Lyft shuttle routes run. They run mostly to affluent parts of Chicago that are transit rich, not transit poor. Now, I talk to reporters a lot, and I give them, my point of view, and then they call Uber and Lyft to get their side. And this is the kind of thing the reporters often hear. They talk about their intent. They talk about the long term, what they expect to work out, which is fine, but it doesn't speak to what happens in the shorter term over the next several years as they expand and you get autonomous vehicles integrated into the fleets, which will ultimately lower the price and spur even greater, accelerate those expansions. We need to be worried not just about the long term, but we also need to be worried about the next few years. And then finally, Andrew Salzberg at Uber, who's the public policy person, has started to say, well, what our goal really should be is to reduce private car ownership. Now, I get why that would be the goal for Uber, right? But if it's private car ownership, meaning instead of me driving me from A to B, to an Uber driver driving to me to pick me up and then taking just me from A to B, that's not a goal the people in cities around the world should be sharing. So we need to be having this conversation, and we need to be having it about cities the way they really are and the way they really work. Otherwise, we'll end up with the world that Hal Harvey has talked about, where autonomy becomes not a good thing for cities, but a bad thing. And that's certainly not what we want to work toward today.